welcome everybody to this virtual panel discussion about the Social Housing White Paper, otherwise known as the Charter for Social Housing Residents. We'll get started. I can see how many participants we've got, and it's sort of stayed static for the last sort of 30 seconds or so. But we've got some housekeeping points to get through first before I introduce you to your panel today. First point to make is that the slides we've done, they're pretty basic. There's really a slide per chapter of the Charter, but they will be sent to you via email afterwards. And of course, you know, if you haven't read it already, we really should direct you to our website to read our full briefing note on the Charter, which is a very good read, if I say so myself. Do use the Q&A button on your screen. You know, as the speakers are speaking, you know, if you want to think up some difficult questions for us, we'll address those at the end. So we'll run through the session with each panelist taking one or more chapters, and then we'll do the Q&As at the end. So this webinar is going to last an hour, and we'll aim to finish our individual sessions by 45 minutes to give us plenty of time. So do use the Q&A button, please, as you go along. And then you'll get a short feedback survey at the end of the session. Again, if I could ask you to let you know your thoughts, I mean, not just on this session, but letting us know what sort of topics you'd like us to address in the future. And we've been doing these panel sessions and webinars on a very regular basis. I mean, at least one a week since lockdown started. The first lockdown started in March. So we've done quite a lot, and you can actually go to our website and see the hub where we've got the recordings of webinars done so far. But do let us know what thoughts you've got about other topics we might want to address. So just by way of introduction, I'm Nick Billingham, and I head up the Housing Management and Property Litigation team. I'm chairing the session today, and I'm also looking at 3 of the chapters. I'm joined by Mark London, our Head of Construction and Engineering. Mark's going to talk to you about Chapter 1, which is all about building safety and fire safety, safe in your home. And Jonathan Jarvis, who's from our governance and corporate team, who's going to look at consumer regulation in particular. And then bringing up the rear is John Corris, who's one of our property partners and our head of sales. He loves that title. That means he specialises in shared ownership for his sins. So he's going to be dealing with home ownership, which is Chapter 7 of the Charter. But just by way of introduction, you know, our briefing note does sort of emphasise this, but there aren't, you know, real game changers in this white paper. I mean, I suppose there are 2 possible game changers. One is the Freedom of Information Scheme, which, you know, is new, and the other one is proactive consumer regulation. Those are the main game changers, but a lot of the rest is either stuff that's already on its way, or really, or improvements to stuff that we've already got in. Or seen before, but I think, you know, when you put all of that together collectively and in the round, the white paper, you know, it will be a culture change for associations, but individually, when you read it, you think, well, it's not really, you know, there's not much there. But as I say, in the round, it will cause a culture change. Particularly for those associations who aren't, you know, aren't ahead of the curve already on things like tenant satisfaction and resident engagement. Anyway, enough of me. I'm going to hand over to Mark now, who's going to talk to you about Chapter 1, to be safe in your home, otherwise known as building safety. So over to you, Mark.
Yes, thank you, Nick. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to this little webinar. Nick is absolutely right. Chapter 1 of the white paper is really a restatement of government intention that we've known about now for at least a year and a half to 2 years, and emphasises the requirements in the Building Safety Bill to set up a resident engagement panel and to produce an effective resident engagement strategy. So it's all about making sure that not only are residents safe in their homes, but that residents, through the resident panel and through effective engagement with the accountable person, actually understand what's going on in their properties. Now, the starting position is that the resident engagement piece is spoken about really in 2 contexts. It's talked about in a very general sense, i.e. the government's aim is to ensure that there is a culture change and that residents are not left sort of trying to understand what is happening in their homes. But the more legal element of it is that all of this stuff, at the moment at least, as it is encapsulated in the Building Safety Bill, only applies to higher risk buildings, that is, to buildings that are over 6 stories in height or over 18 metres in height, as currently measured by the building regulations. Now, there are plans afoot, as I'm sure most of you listening to this will be aware, to reduce the definition of tall building for the purposes of building regulations in England and Wales to 11 metres, which is the position currently in Scotland. And that is likely, although perhaps not immediately, to have an impact on the definition of high risk building in the Building Safety Bill. But for the moment at least, the legal obligations to constitute a resident panel and to produce a resident engagement strategy are really only encapsulated in the Building Safety Bill in effect of higher risk buildings. But nevertheless, the government's intention is that that strategy, that change in culture, is going to permeate its way through an organisation. So not only is it going to have a significant impact in the way that accountable persons and building safety managers liaise with residents in higher risk buildings, but it's going to leach down, if you like, into the way in which we engage with residents across the board. So I want to talk in the brief time I've got available to you about that resident engagement strategy and what the resident panels are going to look like and how an accountable person is going to be expected to interact with residents. And those of you who wish to learn more about the Building Safety Bill can go to our website. There's a very detailed briefing paper that I and my colleagues have prepared, similarly with the Fire Safety Bill. But in terms of the resident engagement strategy, there are really 5 things that it's there to deal with. The first is to set out the information that will be provided to residents by the accountable person. So the starting position is that when you set up your resident engagement strategy, which of course you have to do as part of your Gateway 3 requirements. So unless you've got this stuff done and approved by the building safety regulator, you're not going to be able to occupy the building. So the resident engagement strategy the first thing it's got to do is set out what it is you're going to provide the residents. Now, the bill itself and the white paper talk very generally about building safety, but we know for the time being at least that the Building Safety Bill is concerned with only 2 elements of building safety, that is fire safety and structural safety. There is scope, of course, in the Building Safety Bill to extend that, and the Building Safety Regulator and the Secretary of State have expressed powers to do so. But for the moment, at least, when we talk about building safety, the legal ambit of that, at the moment at least, is in relation to fire and structural safety only. So the sort of stuff that you're going to have to provide to residents and the sort of stuff that you're going to have to make provision for in your resident engagement strategy is perhaps quite obviously the fire risk assessment. There is an absolute expectation and there will be an absolute requirement on accountable persons to provide full and unabridged copies of fire risk assessments to residents. The other things that can affect fire and structural safety are, of course, myriad. So the government anticipates that you're going to be providing planned works programs, so residents will understand when work is being undertaken on their building, whether it's refurbishment work, whether it's a kitchen and bathroom replacement program, things of that nature. You're going to probably have to disclose any material risk assessment that deals with fire or structural safety. So where you're having, as the accountable person, as you're required to do under the Building Safety Bill, assess risks in relation to fire and structural safety, it is almost certainly the case that those risk assessments will be made available to residents. So understanding and encapsulating that category of information that has to be provided is the first thing you're going to have to do. The second thing you're going to have to do, and which is very important, is identify the scope or the ambit of how you're going to consult, what you're going to consult residents about. And as I say, for the moment at least, the legal obligations, as they are encapsulated in the Fire Safety Bill, relate to fire and structural safety only, but that, it seems to me, is slightly artificial, because many of the things that we risk assess in high risk buildings, or indeed buildings of any height, may have fire and structural effects or implications. And so it is highly likely that you're going to be giving a fairly wide ambit of information available to the resident panel to look at and to consider. You're going to have to work out how the accountable person is going to actually get the residents' views on all of this, because it's all very well, of course, providing information. And information that is provided in a vacuum is of no use to anyone unless you understand how the person receiving that information is going to deal with it, and how their views, their comments, their criticisms, be they constructive or otherwise, are going to be relayed to you. So one of the, it seems to me, most important parts of the resident engagement strategy, and it's a point the white paper emphasises over and over again in chapter 1, is you need to identify and set out very clearly how the residents are going to communicate with you, because that communication is going to have to be effective, because if it isn't, the whole process falls down. So you're going to have to put in place regular meetings. You're going to have to identify who on the residents panel is going to be the main spokesperson who liaises with you. And as we can see from the Building Safety Bill, it is anticipated that resident panels will also include consultants or other professionals employed or retained by the residents for the purposes of assisting them with their obligations and the panel's general day-to-day business. So it is highly likely over the course of the next 6 months, I know a number of consultants who are doing this already, who are setting up a resident panel arm so that they can effectively act as the voice of residents. So it is likely going forward that the questions you're going to be asked by residents and that the things that you're going to have to look at will become increasingly more sophisticated as the residents engage with experts and professionals to assist them in asking you the right questions. So you're not going to get away, it seems to me, certainly not for very long, with providing information that is half-baked or inadequate. So how you garner that opinion, the processes you're putting in place to do that are extremely important. You also have to have a methodology for working out whether your engagement strategy is effective. So you'll have to have KPIs in there where the resident, the members of the panel will have to review and rate you in terms of how effective they think the strategy is. And ultimately it is going to be the residents' views about that matter, not yours. So setting that up is also an important part of it. The building safety manager, under the terms of the Building Safety Bill, has the obligation to put in place and manage a complaints procedure. So as part of your resident engagement strategy, you will have to have a comprehensive complaints procedure as part of that. The idea being, of course, that if members of the residents panel or residents generally don't feel they're being listened to or don't feel that they're being taken seriously, then there is a complaints procedure that goes straight to the building safety manager, who then has an obligation to liaise with the accountable person and the resident panel to resolve that complaint. So the resident engagement strategy is a really, really important document. It really goes to the heart of what the white paper is trying to achieve in terms of resident consultation. But in addition to being sort of general and in many respects quite fluffy in terms of what it's aiming to do, it is going to be a legal obligation for those of you who have high risk buildings or are intending to construct them. So if you're in that category of RP, then whether you like it or not, you're going to have to do this, and you're going to have to do it really well. Because if you don't do it really well, then the building safety regulator may not give you an occupation certificate and allow you to occupy the building. So it's very, very important. And that was really all I was going to touch on. As I say, those of you who are aware of the fire safety bill and the building safety bill will know what that means in terms of checking buildings and all the rest of it. And we all know what the the consequences of that have been and what they're likely to be going forward as we look at ever more smaller buildings and we discover the same problems. So I'm going to hand back to Nick now to talk about Chapter 2, and I look forward to fielding some questions later on. Thank you.
Yes, thanks very much, Mark. Yeah, and just to reiterate, do start typing your questions in. Now, an interesting thing that you'll notice that Mark used the term residents throughout his little piece there, and that picks up on a quite an important theme in this charter, which is is definitions. As lawyers, we love definitions, and the first thing you do when you look at this charter is go to page 13 to check the definitions of landlord and check the definition of resident and tenant. And you read that and you're left thoroughly confused. Well, I shouldn't say that. I mean, there is some logic to it, but for example, landlords, there's reference throughout to housing associations and other private registered providers, and that's intended to capture for-profit providers who are not housing associations. Neither of those terms applies to local authorities, although parts of the charter do apply to local authorities. And in Jonathan's session, he'll be looking at what's said about local authorities there. And also, in terms of the definition of occupants, we have residents, which is intended to capture leaseholders as well as tenants, and that is all residents of social housing, so it doesn't capture any non-social housing. And then we've got the term tenant, which is intended to include, intended to mean renters. And the consumer regulation sections talk about tenants, but of course consumer regulation also applies to shared owners until they've staircased up to 100%. While they're shared owners, they are within consumer regulation. So I would say that when you start reading, do have that in mind and look at page 13 and the definitions. Right, so I'm going to look at Chapter 2, and then I'm going to do Chapter 3, and then I'm going to jump to Chapter 6. That means I do a block of chapters, and then I'll hand over to Jonathan to look at 4 and 5. And as I say, then Jonathan Corris will finish off with home ownership. So Chapter 2 introduce this idea of tenant satisfaction measures. I mean, this was something which came out of the Green Paper 2 years ago, and there's been a lot of discussion in the housing press about use of KPIs and exactly how you could set down a measure of any objectivity in relation to tenant satisfaction. And what the government has come up with is a two-pronged approach. One is some objective measures in relation to tenant satisfaction, dealing with state of buildings and landlord's performance and so on, and they're listed in Chapter 2. But also a tenant perception set of measures. Now, how that's going to work in practice is not clear. And we know with KPIs and any sort of measurement that if it's based on perception, then it really depends what question people are asked. If one RP asks a different set of questions in assessing tenant perception of their performance to another, then you're going to find it hard to have any meaningful comparison. The other area, what I describe as a game changer, is the new Access to Information scheme. The debate about housing associations going into the Freedom of Information Act has been around for well over 10 years. You probably remember Grant Shapps threatening housing associations with FOIA in 2010, when we had the whole debate about transparency and publication of government department accounts and so on. And it's been bubbling under for a while. Scottish housing associations are now subject to the Scottish version of FOIA. But here, we've got, rather than putting housing associations into Schedule 1 of FOIA, which would have been an option, the government's come up with a non-statutory scheme which will replicate FOIA. And the reason for that is quite clear. This is about ensuring that we don't go back to that debate about whether housing associations are public or private bodies. And we know they're hybrid public bodies by virtue of the Weaver case in 2009. But clearly government is concerned about legislation which would potentially blur the private-public divide. So this access to information scheme, it's said it's going to replicate FOIA, similar exemptions, although it does say exemptions broadly aligned with the Act, which does give the government some sort of wriggle room in setting out those exemptions. And it's not clear now whether there'll be more exemptions or less exemptions. But I mean, you know, for bigger RPs, I mean, this will be a lot more work. I mean, we know from subject access requests how much work they can involve, but with this access to information scheme, it's much wider because it deals with virtually every document you've got unless an exemption applies. So, you know, freedom of information lawyers and experts, particularly in local authorities who've been grappling with FOIA for many years, they're going to become like gold dust. So there's going to be a big recruitment drive across the sector to get people in who've got experience of FOIA. And as part of that, what we might call the transparency agenda, we're back onto chief executive pay and transparency of remuneration and income. The usual comparison with, you know, the Prime Minister's pay, which is sort of a benchmark whenever you know, chief executive pay comes up. It's very unlikely that the government's going to be able to do anything about that. You know, executive pay is driven by the market, but they just seek to put pressure on by mentioning it from time to time. And you probably all remember the sort of Daily Mail headlines from time back about 10 years ago, showing pictures of chief executives' Range Rovers parked on their drives of their houses. But this does go further. So I mean, it's talking about also about, you know, spend and what money is spent on initiatives. You know, what do housing associations spend their money on, and giving, you know, tenants the opportunity to you know, look at that and in some way sort of comment on it and potentially you know, control it. You know, you can imagine a situation where, you know, tenants might, you know, get together and have a campaign to persuade their landlord to spend money on, you know, on different things, maybe, you know, tenants initiatives rather than new build. And then we've also got this idea of a senior person responsible for ensuring compliance with consumer standards. Now, there are several sort of senior people now that you're going to have. Mark talked about the accountable person in the building safety context. You've also got a senior person who will be responsible for ensuring compliance with the consumer standards. And you've also got somebody who, you know, later on you'll see that you've got somebody at a suitably senior level who will be responsible for health and safety. And the idea here obviously is to have somebody who is accountable, who, you know, tenants can point at, residents and tenants can point at and say, well, you know, this is down to you, this is what you're responsible for. And then we've got annual reports to tenants. Well, you probably remember that there was, in the Tenants Involvement and Empowerment Standard, there was originally a requirement that that housing associations come up with local offers every 3 years. That's not come back, but we have got detailed annual reports to go to tenants. And there's a mention here of use of technology. There's also mention of having an app which tenants can have on their mobile phones, where the association can share information about their spending and about what they're using money for. So interesting to see how that plays out, and whether on that app you'll be able to see how much your chief executive is being paid. So that's chapter 2. Moving on to chapter 3. Chapter 3, this is one of those chapters which is, you know, it's pretty much repeating what's already in force. You know, the complaint handling code was issued by the Ombudsman in July. We had a new revised housing ombudsman scheme, which was introduced in September, and all housing associations should now be have already amended their complaints policies and procedures to comply with the complaint handling code, because you are required to self-assess against the assessment form in the handling code by Christmas to check that your policies and procedures are compliant with the new code. So if you haven't done that already, you know, go to the Ombudsman website, download the complaint handling code, have a read and look at your complaints, policies and procedures and get them in order, ready for Christmas. And then obviously from January, we will have these new sanctions, which will be available to the Ombudsman to issue complaint failure orders or complaint handling failure orders, which is where the Ombudsman finds that there's a defect in either the complaint handling process or associations and other members of the service are not compliant with the handling code and also the scheme. So that's not new. What is new is some stuff around the edges, I suppose. it is, campaigns to make residents aware of their right to complain, an emphasis on associations drawing attention to their complaints policies. This appears in the complaint handling code as well. You're meant to treasure and value complaints because they can be used very effectively to improve your services. We are going to have an independent reviewer of housing ombudsman performance, and the ombudsman is committed to halving the length of time for dealing with complaints. One of the perennial complaints about the ombudsman is how long it takes for complaints to be dealt with, and it can run into 9 months or a year easily. So they're looking to halve the delay by March 2022. And there's a promise of more resources, more people for the Ombudsman service. And also we've got mention of the strengthening the relationship between the Ombudsman and the regulator. But I mean, that's not new, because we've got the revised Memorandum of Understanding, which was introduced in September, which beefed up the relationship between the Ombudsman and the regulator, and when the Ombudsman can dob on associations to the regulator. Publication of case reports at the moment. The Ombudsman does publish a case digest on its website, but it is anonymised. But from when this comes in, the change comes in, the Ombudsman will start identifying landlords and also their complaints history. So not just individual cases, but a sort of review of the complaints performance of individual members. And do remember that all housing associations are mandatory members of the Housing Ombudsman scheme. It's not something you can opt out of. And finally, I've got to mention the removal of the democratic filter. The democratic filter was introduced by the Localism Act 2011. It was when the Ombudsman scheme was last reviewed, and this is the provision that says that if you want to take a complaint to the Ombudsman, number one, you've got to exhaust the complaints procedure of your landlord, but then you've either got to wait 8 weeks, or you've got to go via a designated person, an MP or a councillor, put your complaint to them, ask them to deal with it, and if they feel they can't deal with it, or they deal with it and you're not happy still, then you can refer to the Ombudsman. Now, the democratic filter has been recognised as just being a delay and a bit of red tape, to sort of put people off going to the Ombudsman. So in many ways, it's good to get rid of that. It was a bit of a nonsense, in my view, from the very outset. But another theme here is the pressure here on the Ombudsman to perform. And one of the themes in the Charter is not just about the change which housing associations are going to have to put in place and the pressure on them in terms of resources and costs of complying with all the things that are in the Charter, but the pressure that's going to be on the regulator to perform. So the regulator has got a lot, as you'll see from Jonathan's session on revised consumer regulation, the regulator is going to have a lot on its plate. And the same for the Ombudsman. Government is looking to the Ombudsman to up its game. So moving on to chapter 4. No, I'm going to go to 6, aren't I? Sorry, John, that's yours. So chapter 6, as I say, I'm jumping ahead so that I can hand over to Jonathan. Having a good quality home and neighbourhood to live in, so otherwise known as homes and neighbourhoods. So this posits the proposal to review the Decent Home Standard, which has been around for nearly 20 years. And it makes sense to review it. But the idea here is to bring the energy and the decarbonisation agenda to the fore. So looking at the Decent Home Standard, not just in terms of the quality and standard of the repair of a building, but also looking at energy efficiency and green space is a big part of this chapter, that some residents should have access to green space. So there's a sort of planning aspect there as well. And that's part of this idea of mitigation of health impacts of poor housing. So there's a recognition in the chapter, particularly in relation to mental health, of the effects of COVID, but also generally that mental health is an issue for residents in social housing. Many residents of social housing have existing mental health and vulnerabilities before they're even housed, and that's recognised. And in doing so, government again points to housing associations needing to have more professional staff at the sharp end, or people who are seen to be better able and better qualified to deal with residents in the proper way, and having a degree of professionalism in dealing with mental health issues. ASB obviously gets a look in relation to homes and neighbourhoods, not surprisingly. And here we've got a proposal to reinvigorate the community trigger, otherwise known as the ASB case review, which was introduced by the 2014 Antisocial Behaviour, Crime and Policing Act, but has never really taken off. And this is an ability for a resident who has made a number of complaints and got nowhere to initiate and trigger a case review by a group of the police, their landlord, and the local authority. Now, it doesn't really work very well, because what happens is that if a tenant tries to initiate the community trigger, what usually happens is that the complaint is looked at not often by on a multi-agency approach, and it's pushed back to the landlord to deal with. So it'll be interesting to see how they go about trying to reinvigorate the community trigger. And then lastly, we've got a little bit about allocations, which is maybe something which is tucked away, but may turn out to be more important than we might think. At the moment, associations have very little, if any, legislation which impacts on their allocations policy. In the tenancy standard issued by the regulator, you're required to have a fair and transparent allocation scheme. You're required to cooperate with local authorities in relation to their homeless duties. But beyond that, the only legislation which really impacts is the Equality Act. And you've obviously got to have a policy on allocations which doesn't discriminate either directly or indirectly. But it'll be interesting to see just how this plays out. So do keep an eye on that, because this may herald a change to regulation of allocations. So I'm going to hand over to Jonathan now. Jonathan's going to take you to chapter 4, to be treated with respect, backed by a strong consumer regulator for tenants.
Thanks, Nick. If we could go back to 4, that'd be good. So, as Nick indicated earlier, in many respects, alongside the announcement about the FOIA scheme, this aspect of the Charter is probably the most substantial and meaningful for the sector, certainly in terms of new announcements. I mean, you'll all be familiar with the fact that, of course, consumer standards have been in place since the beginning, since 2012, and there's been an expectation and a requirement for the sector to comply with them. But it's equally the case that, given that the regulator had the responsibility for proactive enforcement and management and compliance of the economic standards, and that its role in relation to consumer standards was reactive, it can be no surprise, therefore, that the consumer standards were pretty much the poor relation in relation to the regime. And what this is all about is achieving parity between compliance with the economic standards, or importance of the consumer standards alongside the economic standards. And that's precisely what the government wants to see. So what's government going to do to achieve that? Well, it's very pleased. When you read through the white paper, they're clearly very pleased with features and the performance of the regulatory functions in relation to economic standards, and so they're planning to try and replicate that for the consumer standard regime. So what we will be seeing is proactive monitoring of consumer standards, the new inevitably beefed up standards, those being in relation to tenancy standard, neighbourhoods, tenant involvement. I'll come to that again in chapter 5. But so we'll see those beefed up. We'll see proactive regulation referred to. Now, what the government has said is it wants the regulator to be responsible for designing the form of that regime for the consumer standards, and will do that through consultation with the sector. And that's going to take some time, and running in parallel with the need for some of the legislative changes to give effect to these changes. We're probably looking at the back end of 2021 before all of this goes live. But so we're going to see some form of proactive monitoring. They refer in the white paper to a blend of desktop surveys, which I suspect is intended to be a little bit similar to what we have under the economic standards regime in terms of having to supply FFRs on an annual basis. It's about having planned investigations akin to the in-depth assessment regime that's used for the economic standards to date, and that there'll be scope for reactive inspection where issues have been identified or where there's whistleblowing. So all of those features are coming in. In the economic standards, we've got codes of practice which amplify the government, the regulators' expectations of what constitutes compliance with those standards, and we're going to see the same introduced for the consumer standards. We're also going to see some beefing up of the regulators' powers. The ones they refer to in the white paper are removing the caps on fines, but perhaps more interestingly, performance improvement plans, which I suspect are intended to be the equivalent of what we've seen in the economic standards regime of voluntary undertakings, where the regulator, negotiates a form of or a contract with the failing RP or the non-compliant RP to bring it back up to a level of compliance without it having to move to the next stage in terms of statutory interventions that the regulator has and has always had, but has tended not to have to use. So we've got all of that. What is interesting, at least to me, is that there's no specific reference in the white paper to the use of gradings for compliance in relation to consumer standards. That in many respects has been the most significant and useful tool for the regulator, being able to downgrade from G1 and G2 down to G3, and the same for financial viability. That has had some real significance, both in terms of potential impact for regulators in terms of compliance with their loans and or the pricing of new funding. So it seems to me that although there's no reference to it in the white paper, and perhaps they wanted to give the regulator some, keep its powder dry and freedom to decide what was best for the sector, and clearly that would form part of the discussions, no doubt. But I think it's very likely that we'll see a grading system introduced for consumer standards, and it'll be interesting to see what the impact of that is. I mean, as I say, almost certainly it'll work its way into the terms of loan covenants, and it might impact on or be used in relation to the new ethical and social investment players and how those interact. So that's that looks like a prompt to move me on to chapter 5. Thank you, Nick. I mean, before I do, I'll just quickly say that two other things, because Nick asked me to mention it: local authorities and the role that that obviously they are part of the consumer standards and have been, but clearly there has been a desire to get the regulator to engage more directly with the local authority sector. I mean, I think it's only a personal view, but I've always felt as though the regulators have been a little bit intimidated by the local authority, particularly the larger ones who have significant clout and influence. And it seems as though this is partly designed to make them shake them up and deliver on that. There's a reference to the right to manage changes and taking out provisions in outsourcing contracts which would interfere with regulation. We'll see what that comes to. And finally, or just before I go on to chapter 5, there's the notion of an advisory committee, which is interesting because it's not intended to be a decision-making body, but clearly I think it's there as a means of ensuring that the regulator balances and continues to achieve parity between the economic standards and the consumer standards regime. It is interesting that they refer to consumer standard element of the regulation being a separate function. And I wonder whether that really means that the government wants to keep its options open about whether it actually needs to create a separate regulatory function for consumer standards going forward. Enough on that, Nick. I'm moving on as you'll be keen for me to do. Chapter 5 is about resident engagement. Perhaps less to say here, actually. I mean, the sector recognised coming out of the Green Paper that this was coming, and has been working in our, certainly from the work we've been doing with RPs, we've seen significant moves towards recognising that there's a need for greater resident engagement, or at least visibility of it. I mean, the tenant involvement and empowerment standard, if you look at it, covers much of what the white paper is asking for. Other than to incorporate some of the bits in relation to continuous improvement, and perhaps in relation to transparency, it's pretty much there. I think the problem with the tenant involvement empowerment standard in many respects has been that the regulators' focus has been on the issues relating to disposals. And so that's where everyone's attention has been within the standard. But if you look beyond it, the sector has been required to take on these types of, or improve its performance in relation to engagement for some time. What does that resident engagement, what will it look like? Well, it's going to be, I mean, in many respects, it's going to be left to the sector to develop its thinking in that respect. I mean, obviously, we have seen in the last few years a reduction in the number of residents on the boards of management of RPs, largely in response to the regulator's requirement for a skills-based board, and this might harbour some changes back, or some recalibration of board constitutions or board compositions, but it's certainly not being prescribed here through the white paper, and there are other aspects and means by which government expects this to be achieved through scrutiny panels, focus groups, and the like. There is going to be this need for the sector to follow best practice, and it'll be interesting to see how that develops. But at the same time, government wants to see and will commit to helping tenants to hold landlords to account, and that's what the reference to opportunities and empowerment programme is about. There's also a reference to commitment to ministerial engagement. Quite what that will take, or the form of it, is not certain, but it might be no more than an open door policy, but that would be better than a revolving door policy that we've had to date. And from on the flip side, a requirement for the RPs to make sure that their client-facing or resident-facing staff have all the requisite skills to deliver the service in the manner that the government wants to see. So we're seeing the development of a working group to identify precisely how we get the skills and whether and if required qualifications to improve that performance. That's as much as I want to say, Nick, on resident engagement. So I'll hand over to John.
Thank you. Oh no, we've gone straight to questions, and thank you. To be honest, I think Nick has teed this one up nicely in relation to. I'll follow up on at the end on Chapter 7, because there isn't masses in Chapter 7 now, which hasn't really been superseded by stuff that's happened since. I do feel a little bit for the authors of the white paper who were dealing with the Chapter 7 section, knowing full well that their colleagues were going to push something else to actually answer a lot of the questions on the shared ownership model that we've all been asking for a while, and actually information has finally come out. So what I'll do just very quickly, so I'm also seeing there's a number of questions come in, which thankfully I've seen are mainly directed towards my colleagues. So I want to give them plenty of time to be able to answer those. But it's just to quickly touch base on some of the key themes, as it were, which have been commented on the article that Nick referred to, that Nick, Mark and Jonathan produced already. One of which is new shared ownership model that's coming out. The comments within this paper, and actually more within the follow-up consultation, which, just a reminder, the consultation in relation to shared ownership is due to come to an end at the precise time of 11:45 p.m. on the 17th of December this year. Those who have noticed other consultations, because seem to be a lot at the moment, they seem to be picking different times on them. So this one is 11:45 p.m. I would recommend you review that if you haven't done so already as organisations, and engage in that consultation, because some quite key questions in there. We've issued a note just highlighting some of the key bits on it, and I'm sure you've already picked up on a number of those. But there is definitely the commitment towards the new shared ownership model. The theme coming out of the various points at the moment is the new model is a model that will be used going forth. There's even reference in the consultation to the fact that they'll be looking under the 106, that the government wants any affordable that's delivered under the 106 as shared ownership to be used as a new model. Whether they're actually thinking of placing local authorities under an obligation to put that specific covenant within 106s, which would seem a logical route if they want to try and achieve this. But it does seem that those conversations about do we not sign up for the next round of funding may fall away if your programme is looking to deliver shared ownership in any event. There's also the point about the comments within it. There's quite a lot of this comment about a fairer shared ownership model. I think the introduction of reduction down to 25 to 10%, they're seen as helping people with the government's continued agenda for home ownership, providing that ability to be able to have that stepping stone into ownership. It does reinforce how much the shared ownership product has taken off from its original infancy to become a staple of our country's housing solution, and how much it's very much needed around the country. The reduction to 25 to 10%, while on one side people may say is fairer, there is a question of actually who's going to be funding the 10%. The consultation sort of makes a nod towards this, but I think there are some serious questions to be asked about: will the institutional lenders be interested in lending at such lower amounts? What mortgage products are going to be available out there? Will it bring in a new tier of funding? So kind of some of the things that unfortunately we saw in relation to some of the right to acquire, right to buys, etc. of old, where different funding streams were coming in order for tenants to be able to afford to buy the properties with a discount. Are we potentially seeing some potentially more unfair mortgage terms coming into play? It's perhaps not for now, but it does raise a question of is everybody happy still with the MPC concept under the shared ownership lease, and in effect guaranteeing the lenders back their monies? There's also, just picking out so very briefly on the chapter 7, there's the shared ownership point. There is also looking at a nod towards local authorities to build more, an obligation and an aim for councils to deliver more and more housing. It kind of moves away from the point of the fact that there is only a finite amount of land that can go through a planning system at the moment, and there's a mass overhaul of that system currently being discussed at the same time. But there's definitely a desire for more to be delivered there. The Chapter 7 also picks up with a nod towards the ground rent reforms that are coming forward. There's reference to there should be no longer leasehold houses, except for in exceptional circumstances. I think that's already in the marketplace, and that's already been adapted and dealt with. I think the market itself dictated what that should look like, although there does seem to be an indication that the government are still looking to follow up more on their leasehold reform, particularly looking towards common hold or different kinds of home ownership, or tenure-based, sorry, I should say. There is also an acknowledgement of no more ground rent should be applied going forward. It will be interesting to see what comes out of the next funding programme and the actual final documents, whether there is a strict line, which I suspect there may be, that no ground rents are to be charged. So you may want to look at your acquisition or approaches in relation to ground rents traditionally. As I said, chapter 7 a bit lighter on information when it comes to it, but there's still live themes from it, which are ongoing debates, and I would recommend looking at that shared ownership consultation. There's a number of points in there, in particular in relation to the cap on internal repairs of £500, or should that be lower? Now's the time to have those conversations. Anyway, I'll hand back to Nick with more questions. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Thanks very much for that, and thanks to Jonathan as well for his sections. Right, we've got some questions in. I have the benefit of being the chair here, so I'm in complete control. There's one for me actually, which I'll take straight away. This is a question about smaller housing associations, and it's saying, do you think that smaller housing associations, and by that I assume we're talking about the smalls, in other words, less than 1,000 units. Do you think smaller housing associations will be better placed to comply with tenant satisfaction measures? I think the answer is yeah, resounding yes. I mean, we know that via the G320, the smaller housing associations have been very effective at resident engagement and tenant satisfaction. We've got to remember that the smaller housing associations make up over 1,000 of the 1,400 associations in the country. They don't have a huge amount of stock, about 5%, but they do make up in numbers. They make up a vast majority of associations. But I think the answer to that one is, from what we've seen, the smalls are good at resident engagement. One for Mark here. What's the timetable for the building safety bill and the fire safety bill coming into force?
It's a very good question. The building safety bill, in order for it to come into force, is going to require quite a bit of subservient regulation. we haven't seen any of that in draft yet. I don't anticipate it coming into force until autumn of 2021, if not early 2022. The government is quite keen to get it on the statute books as soon as possible, but there's a lot of work to do before it's going to be ready, it seems to me. So, I mean, it is possible it could become an act in the summer of next year, but I think realistically it's more likely to be autumn of next year. In terms of the fire safety bill, I think that will happen relatively early next year, probably in the spring.
Excellent. Jonathan, one for you. What about timing, milestones, consultations and legislation before the new consumer regulation provisions come into force? Any views?
Well, I think we think autumn 2021 at the earliest, probably. I mean, I think I mean, obviously there's going to be some pressure on the regulator to develop its regime fairly rapidly, but I'm sure they'll want to try and get it right first time so far as they can, and that will involve, almost certainly some sort of soft market testing with the sector for the next few months, and then there'll be a formal consultation. And at the point at which there's a greater clarity on that, the government will fit time into parliamentary arrangements to make the legislative changes. So I think, as I said a bit earlier, I think late 2021 probably, Nick.
Yeah, great. And John, one for you about shared ownership. So what, somebody's asking, why is there no mention of downward staircasing? A lot of shared owners are facing a degree of hardship, and the white paper is all about the upside of home ownership, but doesn't deal with the downside.
I think, sorry, I think it's fair to say that perhaps there's looking to be a positive spin whenever you talk about these things, shall we say, to be honest, within the white paper. Yes, there has been talk about having a downward ability to be able to ratchet it down. I think there was an underlying theme from those investing within the marketplace that creates even more volatility going forward. And actually, there's been talk about looking upon associations to provide other forms of support or comfort in relation to being able to manage shorter periods of downturn. But they don't want the ability for pressure to be placed on tenants is one argument, that you have to reduce your interest in your home because of a short-term blip, was I believe one phrase that was used.
Excellent. And Mark, one for you. Under building, quite a technical question for you. Under building safety, how do we check that a surveyor is qualified to complete an EWS1 form?
Oh, I was literally just typing out and answering that question as you asked it. It's a very good question from Donna. I mean, if you haven't got a chartered fire engineer, someone who's chartered with the Institute of Fire Engineers, who's carrying out your EWS1 forms, then you need to be satisfied that if you're using a general building surveyor, that they know what they're doing. And the difficulty we have at the moment is that there are quite a number of people out there who are not fire engineers and who are not properly qualified to complete EWS1 forms, and who don't have PI insurance, who are nevertheless prepared to do it. So you do need to ask them a number of questions. If they're not a fire engineer, do they have the requisite PI insurance? What is their experience in reviewing and commenting on external wall systems and things of that nature? Generally, my view is that you should use a fire engineer where you can. Those of you who read the recent government press release on EWS1 forms will have seen that the government is acutely aware of the lack of qualification and the lack of experience in the industry, and that they're prepared to put £700,000 into upskilling people currently within the construction industry so that they can complete these forms. Whether they'll ever get PI insurance to do it remains to be seen, and there's a serious question mark about that. But if you're not using a fire engineer, to answer your question, Donna, you're going to have to carry out far more scrutiny than you would otherwise.
Yeah, and do get the fire engineer or whoever's filling in the EWS form to type it up. I saw one a couple of weeks back, which it looked like it had been completed by a 5-year-old. I mean, everybody's handwriting is suitable to go on these forms, which are then going to be presented to mortgage companies. But there we go, just an aside. Right, Jonathan, one for you. It picks up on something you said, which was about the existing provisions in the TIE and E standard. This question it's interesting that there's no reference to the existing consumer standards in the white paper. they seem to have forgotten about the existing neighbourhood and community standard and the tenant involvement and empowerment standard. A lot of the things they're talking about are already in there.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. But I think, I think that's because this is really about just making sure that the sector addresses and complies with those standards and recognises the need for that to be just as important as economic regulatory compliance. So actually, I think, you know, as I indicated, I don't think the standards themselves, apart from perhaps the home standard, depending on where the decent home standard consultation and review goes, I don't think they will change out of all, you know, change fundamentally. But what will change is how the regulator engages with the sector in getting assurance that there is compliance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've been guilty of occasionally overlooking the neighbourhood and community standard, and I think I'm not alone in that. But you know, it is there, as you say. The focus on consumer standards in the consumer regulation review each year has been really about around the home standard. And obviously, one of the big things here is obviously getting rid of the serious detriment test, which is you know, a key change in relation to consumer regulation. The serious detriment test has been a challenge, I think, to the regulator in deciding when they should intervene. It's quite a complicated definition, and it's certainly been a challenge to advisors advising whether associations should self-refer. But there we go, another thought. Right, well, we're sort of coming fast to the end of the session. You know, it remains really for me to say, you know, thanks very much for tuning in. And do go to our website if you haven't read our briefing note already, and if I didn't mention it once or twice already, I'll mention it a third time. It's well worth a read. You can see it on our website, download it from there. And equally, if you want to get on our database, our client database, to get our briefings and information about webinars, you'll see the link on the feedback form that you get following the end of this session. So just a reminder about that feedback form. Please do fill it in. Let us know what topics you'd like us to look at in the future. And we look forward to seeing you again, either as another virtual panel session or one of our many webinars. So I'll say thanks very much for attending from all the panel, and have a good day. Bye-bye.